Hello, welcome to part 2 of chapter 23, the respiratory system. Now we're going to start looking into more of the physiology behind breathing. How does it happen? How does gas exchange within the lungs actually occur? We're going to look into all of this in the second half of this PowerPoint. So, pulmonary ventilation. That is another term that we use for breathing, and that is air that moves in and out of the lungs. Air that we breathe in go all the way down to those pulmonary alveoli, and it's because of pressure changes. We create pressure changes with the atmosphere around us and within our lungs. And we cause this through contracting and relaxing our respiratory muscles. We're able to actually generate these different pressure changes that are going to allow air to enter and leave the lungs. So this different breathing rates or breathing, there's different things that are going to influence this. The surface tension in those alveoli, lung compliance, and airway resistance. We will look into how all of these play a role with pulmonary ventilation or breathing today. So, atmospheric pressure is measured at about 760 millimeters of mercury. When we're at rest, measurement inside of our lungs and outside of the body are pretty equal. That alveolar pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. The atmosphere around us is also 760 millimeters of mercury. So pressures are equal when our lungs are at rest. But when we take a breath in, we inhale. What triggers the start of that inhalation is this diaphragm that is traveling down. As that diaphragm travels down, our external intercostal muscles also contract, which will lift that rib cage so those lungs can expand. Causes the entire chest cavity to expand. When this happens, this alveolar pressure is going to drop below atmospheric pressure. When atmospheric pressure is below, or when the pressure in the lungs is below atmospheric pressure, it causes air to flow in through the nose, down into the lungs. Because we're trying to equalize out those pressures. If we take a very deep inhalation where we actually consciously breathe in, we use more muscles than the external intercostal muscles in the diaphragm. We actually start using the scalenes that are in our neck, as well as that sternocleidomastoid, because those will help lift that rib cage in other directions so that our lungs can expand even further. So when we go to breathe out, that diaphragm down here goes back to its resting position. Those external intercostal muscles are going to relax so that rib cage goes back down to its resting position. The lungs are going to recoil. They're going to go back to their, again, resting condition. This is going to cause alveolar pressure, to increase. And it goes above atmospheric pressure, not by a whole lot, but it goes enough that it makes a difference. And this is what causes that air to leave the lungs. If we do a forced exhalation, like blowing out candles, that's a good example of a forced exhalation. This is when we use other muscles, those internal intercostals, because they will bring that rib cage, when they're contracted, they bring that rib cage down even further. Your abdominal muscles that contract and compress those abdominal contents. It helps to reduce the size of that chest cavity even further, and it'll actually create a greater difference in that atmospheric pressure from that inside the lungs versus outside of the lungs. So here, this inhalation, this kind of puts us more into words. So right before we take a breath in, our lungs are sitting at 760 millimeters of mercury, which is also equal to 1 atmosphere. It's a unit of measurement that we use when talking about the pressures in the air around us. So for air to actually flow into the lungs, that pressure inside that alveoli has to become lower than that atmospheric pressure. So we do that by contracting that diaphragm, increasing that container, that chest cavity. This kind of plays a role into Boyle's law. Boyle's law is going to talk about pressure changes versus the volume. And within the lungs, the pressure within the lungs versus the volume of air in those lungs. So according to Boyle's law, the pressure of a gas in a closed container is inversely proportional to the volume of that container. So say we have some sort of jar, we've got some lid with a device that can kind of push down on it. We have a lot of different air particles in here. If we were to push this down, pushing all of these air particles below this new purple line, the volume would kind of get smaller. The pressures get higher. So we're kind of going back and forth. So this closed container is increased, the pressure of the gas inside this container decreases. So if I draw this same container over here, if I push this up higher, so the size of that closed container just increased. So the pressure inside of it decreases. If the size of the container is decreased, the pressure inside increases. So this is this inverse relationship. This is Boyle's law. And this is how our lungs work to allow air to flow into or out of the lungs. So here's another example. This one's from your textbook. It talks about, we have this piston in here, air, with all of these air particles floating around. When this piston is up higher over here, there's more space. There's more volume in that container, which means the pressure is lower. But if we push this piston down, all of these air particles have less space to move in. There's less volume in there, so that pressure is a lot higher. It's a whole 1 atmosphere difference from the first picture. So these differences in pressure is what causes air to enter the lungs and leave the lungs. Whoops. When we inhale versus exhale. So to bring air into the lungs, our lungs must expand. By expanding the lungs, we are increasing the volume in those lungs. By increasing the volume, we decrease the pressure. So that pressure goes down. It gets below 1 atmosphere, that 760 millimeters of mercury. So during normal, quiet breathing, which is what you should be doing right now, unless you're listening to this while you're running, those main muscles of inhalation, that diaphragm, and those external intercostals, they contract, lifting the diaphragm contracts as it moves down. The intercostals contract, which lift that rib cage, which is going to cause those lungs to expand. That is what causes air to start traveling into our lungs. That diaphragm, that is the most important muscle, because that gives our lungs the most space to expand by that diaphragm moving down. That changes that atmosphere, the pressure inside the lungs by a few millimeters of mercury. And that's enough to actually cause inhalation of about 500 milliliters of air. Strenuous breathing, you're out running. The diaphragm can descend about 10 centimeters. So it goes down, it pushes down into that abdominal cavity about 10 centimeters down. That can actually create a pressure difference of almost 100 millimeters of mercury. So atmospheric pressures, that 760 millimeters of mercury, it can go all the way down to 660 millimeters of mercury during strenuous breathing. We can take in as much as 2 to 3 liters of air per breath. Your diaphragm is responsible for almost 75% of the air that we take in. So most of that air comes from the diaphragm. So I said that's the most important muscle. It travels down, which increases that chest cavity the most. External intercostals are the other muscles. When they contract, that rib cage rises up and out. And when that happens, it gives space for those lungs to expand laterally. It's only responsible for about 25% of the air that we breathe during quiet breathing. So these different intercostals, the external intercostals, if you look at the direction, they're all facing and going in this backwards angle. So they're going to lift the rib cage out this direction. Expand out while this diaphragm that comes through here will push down whenever we take a breath. So here's this diaphragm. We can see where that diaphragm sits during exhalation and during inhalation. You can see by this faded gray kind of drawing, you can see what happens to those ribs. That sternum even moves out as those external intercostals are going to contract to allow for more space into your thoracic cavity. When the pressures in the lungs change, the pressures in that intrapleural space, that pleural cavity, that membrane that surrounds the lungs, between that membrane is that pleural cavity, that also changes. It's a negative pressure that's between 754 to 756 during normal breathing. It has a negative pressure because it functions as what is like a vacuum. It sucks. So it helps by that visceral pleura that sits on those lungs, that parietal pleura that faces that chest wall and is attached to that chest wall. It helps to create that pressure to cause that air to go in every time that you breathe in. So this says, as if the thoracic cavity increases in size, the lungs are going to expand because that parietal pleura is attached to that chest wall, which is going to cause those lungs to expand. The lungs are also going to expand when that thoracic cavity expands. So if that thoracic cavity decreases in size, the lungs are going to recoil. They're going to become smaller too. So just before we take a breath in, that intrapleural pressure is about 4 millimeters mercury less than that atmospheric pressure, so about 756. When that diaphragm contracts, those external intercostals contract, that thoracic cavity gets larger. Those lungs are going to increase in size, but that pleural cavity, that volume in there also increases. Or no, it decreases, sorry, to 754. That parietal pleural lining, it's pulled outward in all directions. That visceral pleura on the lungs gets pulled right with it. So as the thoracic cavity expands, that parietal pleura expands, which causes those lungs to expand. Everything is expanding whenever we take a breath in. The alveolar pressure. There's a lot of different pressures to look at. This is where gas exchange is happening, is in the alveoli. So when the volume of the lungs increases, the alveolar pressure, it drops by 1 millimeter of mercury. And that's enough of a difference between the atmosphere and that pulmonary alveoli to allow air to start flowing in. It was mentioned in your Anatomy 1 class when different particles, or in this case, air and pressure, like to move from an area of high particles or pressure to an area of low particles or pressure. So it kind of likes to try to even everything out. So since the pressure inside the lungs and inside those alveoli are now lower pressure than that atmosphere, we want to even it out so it's at atmospheric pressure. So that in itself is what causes that air to move into the lungs. Air will continue to flow in. You'll continue to breathe in as long as we have that pressure difference. So that increase in lung volume is because of that lengthening and expansion of those alveolar ducts and the increase in the size of the openings of the alveoli. If you were to forcefully take a deep breath in, we use different accessory muscles, that sternocleidomastoid, and those scalenes, even that pectoralis minor, to help lift even further. That sternocleidomastoid lifts that sternum. Those scalenes lift those first two ribs because that's their insertion points. And muscles move at their insertion points are the movable parts. Pectoralis minor is attached to those third through fifth ribs in the front, so it's going to pull those ribs up in the front even. So here's that same picture that from before that kind of shows by that diaphragm contracting in those external intercostals contracting, it's lifting that rib cage, that parietal pleura, that visceral pleura that's attached to the lungs, they all start to expand, which causes the lungs to expand. As those pressure differences inside of the lungs drops below atmospheric pressure, that is what causes air to flow in when you inhale. So let's go through exhalation. And again, it's due to pressure gradient, pressure changes. But this time, it's in the opposite direction. Because once we take a breath in, all of a sudden, the pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. So we've taken in more air, that the pressure inside of the lungs is now higher than that 760 millimeters of mercury. This is a pretty passive process during normal exhalation. So when you breathe out, normally it's a pretty passive process. There's no muscle contractions involved. There's just muscles relaxing back down. Because that diaphragm relaxes, because those external intercostals relax, that chest wall is going to recoil. So it's going to go back to its normal size. Those lungs are going to go back to their normal size, which causes air to move out. So whenever we did elastic recoil, those elastic fibers that we stretched when we inhaled, because our lungs have these different elastic fibers in them. So when we inhale, we stretch those elastic fibers, they're going to recoil back down. That surface tension from that intrapleural fluid is also pulled in. When these exhalation or inspiratory muscles relax during exhalation, that diaphragm goes back to its resting position. Those external intercostals go back to their resting position, which causes, again, those lungs to decrease in size. At the beginning of that exhalation, the alveolar pressure is about 762 millimeters of mercury. So that is 2 millimeters of mercury higher than atmospheric pressure. And again, air wants to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So this time, the pressure inside the lungs is greater than outside. So that's what causes causes the air to leave our lungs when we exhale. Exhalation is only active during certain forceful breathing. Playing wind instruments, exercising, blowing out candles is even forceful exhalation. And this is where we get those internal intercostals, because when those muscles contract, they pull that rib cage down, that abdominal cavity, because that creates more pressure into that abdominal region. When those contract, contraction of those abdominal muscles pulls those ribs down even further. That interpleural pressure is always going to be less than alveolar pressure. The only time it can exceed atmospheric pressure is during something forceful like a cough. That's the only time that interpleural pressure may be above atmospheric pressure. So there's other factors that play a role into all of this. The surface tension of those alveoli. We mentioned that with the surfactant in the first half of this pulmonary lecture. So let's look at how it plays a role. So we have surface tension at any air-water interface. So where water and air come in contact, we create surface tension. If you have a bottle of water sitting by you, between that water and then the air above it, there's surface tension there. And it's because water molecules are polar. There's water molecules, because of those hydrogen bonds, they're attracted to each other more than the gas in the air. Those hydrogen bonds create a pretty strong bond, and they want to stay bonded to these different water molecules. They don't care about the air around it. And that's what creates this surface tension. So when liquid surrounds a sphere of air, like a soap bubble, this surface tension actually produces this inward force. So if we have this alveoli, per se, surface tension is traveling inward. So this surface tension is causing these alveoli to be as small as they possibly can. So when we're breathing, that surface tension has to be higher. It has to overcome all this surface tension. This air that's coming in has to overcome this surface tension to allow these alveoli to expand. So this surface tension accounts for about 2/3 of that elastic recoil. Surfactant. We have surfactant that is part of this alveolar fluid. Its goal is to reduce surface tension between the surface tension of water and that air. Premature babies may be deficient in surfactant. And this is what causes respiratory distress syndrome in newborns. It's because their lungs aren't generating this surfactant yet. So it causes, every time they exhale, those alveoli to collapse. The surfactant is preventing these alveoli from collapsing. So every time they breathe out, those alveoli collapse, and then they have to overcome that collapsion, or the collapsing of those alveoli, every time they breathe in, just to get air back into their lungs. Compliance is something else that plays a role in our breathing, and that's compliance. Compliance is how much effort is required to stretch the lungs and chest wall. If we have high compliance, the lungs and the chest wall expand slowly. Low compliance, they resist expansion. And it relates to the elasticity and those surface tension of those alveoli. We normally have high compliance. Our lungs expand pretty easily. There's things that can cause decreased compliance so the lungs don't expand as easily. If there's any kind of scar tissue on the lungs, scar tissue is made of connective tissue and it doesn't stretch as easily as your lungs do. If your lungs become filled with fluid, there's no place for that air to go because there's fluid in there. If you have a deficiency in surfactant, those pneumocytes don't produce surfactant or not enough surfactant, those alveoli are going to start collapsing every time you exhale. If there's anything that impedes lung expansion in any way, if you've ever broken a rib before, you will feel this. Cracked a rib, broke a rib, same thing. But it's a really hard, it hurts every time you take a breath in. And unfortunately, treatment for a cracked rib, you can't immobilize it very much because it already restricts your breathing. So this is going to impede that lung expansion because it hurts every time you take a breath in. There's also examples where we have increased lung compliance, like an emphysema. In emphysema, these elastic fibers and those alveolar walls are actually, they get destructed. They get broken apart. So there's not as much elastic stretching in our lungs every time we take a breath in. Airway resistance is going to play a role in your breathing. So it's kind of similar to how we talked about it a little bit in the blood vessel chapter. So how the rate that the air is flowing through those airways, the size of the airways, this is all going to play a role. The larger the diameter of those airways, they have a decreased resistance, meaning air is going to go in very easily. When you're exercising, your sympathetic nervous system is in charge more. So we're going to release more epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what that does is it works as a bronchodilator. That sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So it causes the relaxation, which increases the size of the airway, which will decrease resistance, make those airways larger. That parasympathetic, when you're laying in bed doing nothing, it causes those airways to get smaller. The smaller the airways, the harder it is to get that air in, so that increases resistance. There's different breathing patterns. Eupnea. This is like a combination of shallow breathing with deep breathing be in between. It could be just deep breathing or just shallow breathing. Costal breathing. This is using those external intercostals more than that diaphragm to breathe. This specifically is due to vanity. You suck your stomach in, you want to make yourself look smaller than you are. It prevents that diaphragm from moving much. And it causes those ribs to expand more to breathe. Diaphragmatic breathing, it's technically, it should be normal breathing, but this says deep breathing that consists of that diaphragm moves out, which actually causes your stomach to expand a little bit more to allow enough air to come in. Diaphragmatic breathing is more of what should be a normal breathing. Our breathing also, it lets us express different emotions. Your breathing patterns are what lets you laugh, what lets you sigh, what lets you cry. So here's a bunch of other things that breathing will let you do. Let you cough, sneeze, yawn, hiccup. Ooh, hiccuping is fun. Hiccuping is actually a spasm, usually within that phrenic nerve that's causing that, it's something usually within that phrenic nerve that causes spasmodic contraction of the diaphragm. So it's causing, every time you hiccup, that's a contraction of that diaphragm, kind of spasming out. So we have ways, of course, to test lung volumes and capacities. We usually use a spirometer. We have some of these in the lab. We can have a chance to kind of play with them and use them and see how your breathing is. We can use those spirometers to figure out your lung capacities, which is those different lung volumes. A spirometer is going to measure those volumes and capacities. A spirogram is where we record those breathing patterns over time. So when you're at rest, an adult usually breathes about 12 breaths per minute. Here's the thing. Somebody else has to measure it, and you cannot be consciously aware of what they're doing. As soon as you're consciously aware of what you're doing, it's really hard to still breathe normally, to allow someone to be able to measure out those 12 breaths per minute. When I was taught to check breathing rate, I was taught to take pulse and breathing rate at the same time. You count for about 30 seconds. You count the first 15 seconds pulse rate, you multiply that by 4. The next 15 seconds, you count breathing rate, multiply that by 4. And that'll give you about your pulse rate and your breathing rate at the same time. Patients usually just think, well, they're counting for 30 seconds and they're going to just multiply it by 2. They don't realize that you're actually taking their breathing rate at the same time. So anyways, your normal breath is that full inhalation and exhalation. Normal adults will move about 500 milliliters of air into and out of the lungs. That is known as your tidal volume. How much air you take in and out on a normal breath. It does vary from person to person, but 12 breaths is about average. 500 milliliters of air is about average. About 70% of that air you're breathing in is going to reach those bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli. The rest of it will remain in those conducting zones. We do have anatomical dead space in our lungs. And this is where there is no respiratory exchange happening. And that is because some of this air that we are breathing in remains in this anatomical dead space. Inspiratory reserve volume. So if you take a deep breath in, you're able to inhale more than 500 milliliters. You usually can take in more than another 500 milliliters. The average male can take in about 3,100 milliliters of air and through their inspiratory reserve. Females can take in about 1,900 in their inspiratory reserve. Again, everybody's a little bit different, and it's just going to depend on the size of the person, size of the lungs. Everything is a little bit different in every person. So if you do a forced exhalation before you inhale, take a deep breath in, you can take in even more air. That's where we get that like 1,900 in females, 3,100 in men. If you do that forced exhalation out and then take a deep breath in, you're actually able to take in more air than during a normal breath, or even a deep breath after a normal breath. So this forced exhalation is that expiratory reserve volume, that extra air that you can forcefully breathe out beyond that normal breath. This forced expiratory volume in 1 second, this is what we tend to measure with those spirometers. It's how much air you can breathe out after a maximal inhalation. Even after this forced expiratory reserve volume, you get rid of that, we still have air left in the lungs. And that's because of that intrapleural pressure. And it helps to keep those alveoli inflated. This is that residual volume, about 1,200 in males, 1,100 in females. We also have this minimal volume, which is any air that is remaining. And this minimal volume of air is actually used to help determine if babies were stillborn or if they died after birth. They can use this minimal volume to determine when a baby may have died. These are all different measurements that are used to figure out, because if the baby was stillborn, there would be zero air in the lungs. There'd probably still be fluid in the lung, like fluid in there. So this tidal volume here, this is your normal breathing. We have that inspiratory reserve, how much extra air you can take in. That expiratory reserve, how much extra air you can breathe out. But we still have that residual volume. How much is left in the lungs after that forced exhalation. The total lung capacity is usually about 6,000 milliliters. So there is ways to calculate some of this stuff out, that inspiratory capacity. An inspiratory capacity is that tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. Functional residual capacity, it's that residual volume and that expiratory reserve volume. That vital capacity, inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume, and then that total lung capacity. That vital capacity and residual volumes. So some of the things that we may be measured is minute ventilation. So that total volume of air that we can breathe in and out each minute. So we take that tidal volume and we multiply it by that respiratory rate. 500 milliliters of air breathing in every breath times 12 breaths is about 6,000 milliliters of air per minute. If it's less than that, there's usually some kind of pulmonary malfunction. We also have alveolar ventilation. The amount of air that actually reaches that respiratory zone. It's about 4,200 milliliters per minute. So this video kind of goes through these respiratory volumes and capacities. So let's look at Dalton's law, another law relating to breathing. This time we're looking at the mixture of gases. According to Dalton's law, each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure as if no other gases were present. And this is known as partial pressure, P of sub X. These different gases that are found in the atmosphere. So our atmosphere, whenever we breathe in, it's a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and carbon dioxide. There's also water vapor. There's even other gases that are in such small quantities that we don't necessarily talk about those. The air we're breathing in is about 78.6% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, and then 0.06% is even those other gases that are found in the air. And these partial pressures are actually determined that oxygen and carbon dioxide movement between the lungs and the blood, and then the blood and the body cells. So these gases, they diffuse across that membrane, again, from an area where that pressure, partial pressure is greater to that area where that partial pressure is less. So we still apply that same theory where particles, anything moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. It happens all over the body. So that alveolar air usually has less oxygen than inhaled air, and it has more carbon dioxide. So when gases are exchanged, those alveoli increase the carbon dioxide and it decreases the oxygen, because that oxygen diffuses towards the lung or towards the blood. That carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood back into the lungs. So this kind of shows us these different atmospheric pressures and how these different gases make up that 760 milliliters of mercury that we find in atmospheric pressure. So here's an interesting thought. Exhaled air still has more oxygen than alveolar air and less carbon dioxide because some of the air that we actually breathed out was technically in that anatomical dead space, so it didn't participate in gas exchange. Whenever we breathe out, we exhale, we're breathing out some that air from that alveoli and some of that air from that anatomical dead space. So here's another law. Henry's law this time. So the quantity of a gas that will dissolve in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility coefficient when the temperature remains consistent. So the ability of these gases to stay in solution if greater or is greater when its partial pressure is higher and when it has a high solubility of water. The higher the partial pressure of a gas, the higher the solubility. The more gas will stay in a solution. There's a lot more carbon dioxide that is dissolved in that blood plasma because carbon dioxide is more soluble than oxygen is. So part of this Henry's law tells us two different conditions. So as the total air pressure increases, the partial pressure of all of its gases increases. Nitrogen can dissolve in plasma. It can dissolve in interstitial fluid. If we have too much nitrogen, it produces giddiness. And it can actually give us similar symptoms to alcohol intoxication if there's too much nitrogen in the air. So if a diver comes to the surface slowly, that nitrogen that's dissolved in our blood plasma, we can eliminate it by breathing out. If you descend too quickly, nitrogen actually comes out of that solution and it starts to form gas bubbles in our tissues. And this is what gives that decompression sickness. And we usually see those gas bubbles in the nervous tissue. And depending on how many bubbles are formed, it can cause mild to severe symptoms: joint pain, dizziness, shortness of breath, fatigue, paralysis, and in extreme severe cases, unconsciousness. Hyperbaric oxygenation. This can be used to actually get more oxygen to dissolve into the blood. So if somebody has an anaerobic bacteria in their system, again, anaerobic, it does not use or it does not like oxygen. And anaerobic bacteria does not like oxygen. Tetanus and gangrene are two different bacteria that cannot live in the presence of oxygen. So these people can be placed into a hyperbaric chamber. That there's more oxygen in that air. It's at a greater pressure, greater than 1 atmosphere pressure. So these body tissues are going to pick up more and more oxygen. The more oxygen these tissues pick up, it causes this bacteria to be killed because they don't like oxygen. They can't live in oxygen. They can treat heart disorders, anybody who's ever had carbon monoxide but poisoning, embolisms, gas embolisms, crush injuries, cerebral edema, different bone infections, smoke inhalation. Somebody who may have been in a fire, they may be put into a hyperbaric chamber. Near drowning, try to help clear that water out of the lungs. Asphyxia, vascular insufficiencies, burns. They can use these hyperbaric chambers for a lot of different reasons. And what they're doing is trying to push more oxygen into the system. So, external and internal respiration. External respiration, or that pulmonary gas exchange, is where that oxygen that we are breathing in will diffuse from that pulmonary alveoli in the lungs into the pulmonary capillaries, into those red blood cells. Carbon dioxide will diffuse the other direction. So we're taking that deoxygenated blood that just came from the right side of the heart, and we are turning it into oxygenated blood that will go to the left side of the heart that will travel around the body. So as blood goes through these pulmonary capillaries in the lungs, this oxygen diffuses out of the blood, out of the lungs, it diffuses into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood back into the lungs so we can breathe it out. If you're exercising, the pressure of oxygen actually can be lower than if you are just sitting, because your muscles are working hard and they're using more oxygen. We want to increase that, which the amount of oxygen. So it's kind of interesting how all this works. Here's this nice drawing that shows the blue, again, is that deoxygenated blood going into the lungs. We're exchanging, we're getting rid of this carbon dioxide. Bye. We're picking up this oxygen. We take it back to the heart so it can go around to the body. We get rid of that oxygen into the cells, and we pick up carbon dioxide to breathe out. Internal respiration is that actual gas exchange that is happening, and it's happening between the capillaries and the tissues. So oxygen, which is what the bottom part of the picture right above shows, because of the pressures of oxygen inside of the cells is higher, or inside the blood is higher than the cells. Again, oxygen is going to go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So oxygen diffuses out of that bloodstream. Same goes for carbon dioxide. The pressure of carbon dioxide in that bloodstream is lower than the cells, so it causes that carbon dioxide diffuse out of the cells into the bloodstream. How do we transport oxygen and carbon dioxide? So, majority of that oxygen is carried on that hemoglobin molecule inside of those red blood cells. Only a very small percent of it is dissolved in that plasma, 1.5%. It's very small. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, it can be dissolved in the plasma because carbon dioxide dissolves in water or liquids easier or better than oxygen does. It can be carried in that hemoglobin, and that carbohemoglobin, but most of it is transported as bicarbonate ions. So we take that carbon dioxide we turn it into bicarbonate through different reactions. We get bicarbonate and we get a water as a byproduct. And then it switches back to carbon dioxide before it is exchanged in the lungs to go back to be breathed out. Here's the interesting thing. The oxygen that is attached to the hemoglobin is actually trapped inside those red blood cells. The dissolved oxygen is what'll diffuse out of the tissues, out of those tissue capillaries, and into those actual tissues. So that hemoglobin that is inside of these red blood cells, or the oxygen that is attached to that hemoglobin, accounts for majority of the oxygen we have in our body. Oxygen has to be dissolved into our blood before it can actually leave the blood. Carbon dioxide can go through in one of 3 different ways. Be carried it through that blood. So what affects how much oxygen binds to hemoglobin is actually the pressure of that oxygen. So the higher that pressure of oxygen is, the more oxygen combines with hemoglobin. So the higher the pressure of oxygen, the more oxygen combines with hemoglobin. When the hemoglobin is completely converted to oxyhemoglobin, that hemoglobin is fully saturated. When that hemoglobin, and it has a mixture of hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin, it is partially saturated. So that percent saturation of hemoglobin tells us that average saturation. So how much oxygen is attached to that hemoglobin. So if a hemoglobin has 2 oxygen molecules, it's 50% saturated, because each hemoglobin can bind a total of 4 oxygen molecules. So the greater the pressure of oxygen, the more oxygen will bind to hemoglobin until the available hemoglobin molecules are completely saturated. In those pulmonary capillaries, that pressure of oxygen is very high, which causes a lot of oxygen to bind to that hemoglobin. But in those tissue capillaries, that pressure of oxygen is lower. So that hemoglobin does not help much. It's the dissolved oxygen that is unloaded, and that's what diffuses into these different cells. So if we look at what affects that affinity for hemoglobin for oxygen here. Contracting muscles, that deoxygenated blood, that deoxygenated blood in those systemic veins, and even that oxygenated blood in those arteries. This is going to change how much hemoglobin or how much oxygen is attached to that hemoglobin. So that affinity, it's how tight that oxygen is attached to that hemoglobin. So in acidity, that pH is too low. that affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen decreases. So oxygen detaches from hemoglobin a lot easier. When that affinity for hemoglobin is lower, oxygen detaches from hemoglobin a lot easier. The increased acidity enhances the unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. This is known as the Bohr effect. Hydrogen is what changes that acidity in the blood. The more hydrogen molecules, which means the lower the pH, is going to cause that oxygen to unload from that hemoglobin. The binding of oxygen to hemoglobin causes the unloading of hydrogen from hemoglobin. So that hemoglobin can actually act as a buffer system to try to keep our blood pH within a somewhat of a normal range there. So when hydrogen ions bind to different amino acids in this hemoglobin, it changes that structure and it actually decreases that oxygen carrying capacity. The lower the pH, that means the more acidic, the less oxygen is going to bind. The less oxygen that is going to bind, the more oxygen there's available for our tissues. The higher the pH, that means the less hydrogen ions available there. That increases the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. So more oxygen is going to bind to that hemoglobin. So even your pH of your blood and this hemoglobin is all going to play a role in how much oxygen is actually available for our tissues. So if we're looking at blood pH, the higher the pH, the more basic, which means the more oxygen is going to bind. The lower the pH means we have more hydrogen ions, the more acidic. That's going to cause oxygen to leave that hemoglobin, get dissolved into that fluid and into that serum, which will cause more oxygen available for tissues. So let's look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. That's what the second chart is about. We'll come back and look at it in a second after we explain it. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide can also bind to that hemoglobin, and it has a similar effect that hydrogen does with that acidity. So as the pressure of carbon dioxide rises, hemoglobin is going to release more oxygen molecules out. The pressure of carbon dioxide and that pH, they're both kind of related because lower blood pH is from high pressure of carbon dioxide. So as our tissues, as we're going through the blood is going through the capillaries and our tissues are getting rid of their waste products, carbon dioxide being one of those, that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the bloodstream. It can be temporarily converted into that carbonic acid. And it uses that enzyme carbonic anhydrase. So that carbonic acid, it's formed inside the red blood cells, and it's going to dissociate into these hydrogen atoms and bicarbonate. I mentioned water before, I was wrong. It's hydrogen. So this carbonic acid, as the middle product here, we start with our carbon dioxide in our water. We use carbonic anhydrase to get carbonic acid, which will eventually turn into a bicarbonate ion and hydrogen. This increases the pH of the blood because hydrogen deals with that pH. When you're exercising, lactic acid in the blood, it actually causes that blood pH to go down. So it causes it to be more acidic because lactic acid is acidic. It's an acid. So that also decreases that blood pH, which causes oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin to be more readily available for tissues. Whoops. So that's what this second chart over here is showing. So if we have a low amount of carbon dioxide, or that pressure for carbon dioxide in the blood, more oxygen is going to bind. If we have a lot of that pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, more oxygen is going to be released from that hemoglobin to be readily available for those tissues. This next one, temperature. Temperature is going to play a role. So as your body temperature gets higher, that hemoglobin is also going to release oxygen. Heat is a byproduct of any metabolic reaction that is happening. Heat is released anytime a muscle contraction or muscle contracts. So when your cells are metabolically active, you're exercising or walking, your cells are metabolically active when you're walking, even. They require more oxygen to be able to generate that energy, which in turn, your cells are going to release more acids, they're going to release more heat, and it causes that oxygen to be released from that oxyhemoglobin. Fever actually produces similar results. Hypothermia, that's a new one. Hypothermia, you're really cold. That cell metabolism just gets slower and slower. So if your cell metabolism gets slower, the need for oxygen decreases. Oxygen is going to remain bound to that hemoglobin because we're not needing it. That's where this chart comes into play. So the lower the temperature, the more oxygen stays bound to hemoglobin. The higher the temperature, the more oxygen is being released from that hemoglobin. BPG, bisphosphoglycerate. It's something else that is found in red blood cells. And it actually decreases the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And that's what helps our red blood cells unload oxygen from that hemoglobin. So this is actually a byproduct of glycolysis, where we produce ATP. When this bisphosphoglycerate combines with hemoglobin, it actually binds to that terminal amino group of these beta globulin chains. Oxygen doesn't bind as tightly at this point. So the more bisphosphoglycerate, the more oxygen gets released. Hormones can have some of this effect. Thyroxine, thyroid hormone, growth hormone, epinephrine, norepinephrine, testosterone, they cause more of this bisphosphoglycerate to be created which causes more oxygen unloading from that hemoglobin. People who live in higher altitudes actually have higher levels of this bisphosphoglycerate. It makes more oxygen readily available for their tissues. Fetal hemoglobin versus an adult, they differ. Fetal hemoglobin actually has a higher affinity for oxygen, so it's going to bind to oxygen a lot stronger. It doesn't bind those bisphosphoglycerates as well. So when that pressure for oxygen is low, that fetal hemoglobin can carry 30% more oxygen than their mother's hemoglobin can. So when that mother's blood enters that placenta through the process of getting that child or that fetus the nutrients that they need, including oxygen for their tissues, oxygen easily gets transferred over to that fetal blood, over to that fetal hemoglobin. If there's that maternal blood and the placenta is low, if that oxygen saturation is low, that fetus may actually suffer hypoxia. They're not getting enough oxygen in, and there's not as much of affinity for oxygen for that hemoglobin. So these pressures are going to play a role in a fetus and getting the oxygen they need as well, because that fetal hemoglobin will bind oxygen more readily than the mother's will. So more about that carbon dioxide. So when you're just resting, sitting, laying down, for every 100 milliliters of deoxygenated blood, there is about 53 milliliters of carbon dioxide in there. It could be dissolved. Some of that carbon dioxide gets dissolved into the plasma. That carbino compound, which is that, combines with amino acids in the blood, forming these carbino compounds. Then we have that bicarbonate ion, which is how most of it. So that bicarbonate plus those hydrogen ions as that byproduct in the formation of bicarbonate. These are all different ways that we're going to find carbon dioxide in the blood. So as their blood picks up this carbon dioxide, bicarbonate starts to accumulate. Some will move across that concentration gradient to actually be pushed into the plasma, but most of it is still technically inside of those red blood cells. Chloride. Chloride will move into those red blood cells. So this is what's called a chloride shift. When we exchange negative ions, bicarbonate is a negative ion, chloride is a negative ion. We're exchanging negative ions because we're maintaining these different electrical balances. We're getting rid of that bicarbonate that goes out into the plasma as chloride goes in. We're maintaining that balance. It's that chloride shift. So as carbon dioxide is removed from the tissues and transported into the blood, it becomes that bicarbonate. blood will go through those pulmonary capillaries in the lungs. These reactions get reversed, which is where we get carbon dioxide that we breathe out. We don't breathe out bicarbonate. We breathe out carbon dioxide. So how much carbon dioxide we can travel in the blood actually depends on that hemoglobin saturation of oxygen. The lower the amount of oxygen bound to that hemoglobin, that oxyhemoglobin, the more carbon dioxide we can take on. This is the Haldane effect. Yes, there's a lot of different names within this respiratory system based on who discovered it, unfortunately. Everyone puts their name on stuff, so there's a lot of different things that relate to something different within the respiratory system. Deoxyhemoglobin binds to and transfers more carbon dioxide than does oxyhemoglobin. Deoxyhemoglobin also buffers more hydrogen than oxyhemoglobin. So it removes that hydrogen from a solution, which prompts the conversion of carbon dioxide to bicarbonate. These are the two effects of this Haldane effect. So deoxyhemoglobin is going to bind more carbon dioxide than it does oxygen, and deoxyhemoglobin is going to buffer more hydrogen than oxyhemoglobin does. So during this whole process, we have in the pulmonary at the top, we can see all of these different reactions that are happening inside of this red blood cell. So we have that hydrogen plus that bicarbonate, which gives us carbonic acid, which with that carbonic anhydrase gives us water and carbon dioxide. That allows us to get rid of that carbon dioxide to breathe it out. The oxygen that we bring in gets bound to that hemoglobin, which will give us that oxyhemoglobin plus hydrogen. Hemoglobin can also bind to carbon dioxide, deoxyhemoglobin, which will get split apart so that carbon dioxide can be breathed out. We also have that chloride shift. So when carbon dioxide goes into the cell, that chloride goes in. So when that carbon dioxide leaves, chloride leaves. In the tissues, it's the exact opposite. Carbon dioxide is leaving the cells, can be bound to hemoglobin, can be turned into bicarbonate. That oxygen is leaving. Bicarbonate can float in the plasma. Chloride is going into the cell. That chloride shift. So when you're sitting in class, about 200 milliliters of oxygen is used every minute. During strenuous exercise, that can increase by 15 to 20 fold in a normal person, as much as 30 times in an elite endurance athlete. So there's different areas in the brain that are going to play roles in this respiratory center. We have this medullary respiratory center. And within this, and then we also have the pontine respiratory group in the pons. They're named for what part of the brain stem they are in. So this medullary respiratory center, we have this dorsal respiratory group and this ventral respiratory group. So during normal breathing, that dorsal respiratory group is what will move that diaphragm and those external intercostal muscles. it releases out these action potentials in bursts, which causes the muscles to contract and inhalation to occur. When this dorsal respiratory group becomes an active, that diaphragm and those intercostal muscles will relax for about 3 seconds. That's what allows you to exhale. That ventral respiratory group or pre-Bratzinger complex, it's thought to be important in the rhythm of breathing. It's thought, so we're not 100% sure, but that's what people believe this part of the brain has to deal with. Because there's pacemaker cells in there. And they're going to send this information through the dorsal respiratory group first to keep this rhythmic breathing pattern going. The ventral respiratory group is also active when you're forcefully breathing, like exercise, playing a wind instrument, even at high altitudes, you're forcefully breathing. If you've never been at higher altitudes, over 10,000 feet, it takes a lot deeper breaths, a lot more forceful breathing to get enough oxygen in to move up there. So in this medulla and this pons, we have this dorsal and this ventral respiratory group. Dorsal respiratory group is what sends out signals to allow that diaphragm and those external intercostals to contract. And when it stops sending signals, they relax and you exhale. That ventral respiratory group, forceful breathing, and when you are, and it keeps that kind of rhythm. That's the word I was looking for. So this chart kind of goes through and explains what is happening when, like I said, that dorsal respiratory group in that medulla, when it is active, you're inhaling. When it is inactive, no longer sending sending messages, it causes the muscles to relax, which is what causes exhalation. So that forceful exhalation, that ventral respiratory group works because that dorsal respiratory group is inactive. Sorry, I said that. The dorsal respiratory group is inactive. The ventral respiratory group is inactive during forceful exhalation. We have the pontine respiratory group. This pontine respiratory group does inhalation and exhalation. These neurons are working. They actually send information to that dorsal respiratory group in the medulla. The pontine respiratory group, they think they play a role in modifying the basic rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, exercising, speaking, and sleeping. Of course, your cortex is going to play a role in this. This is what consciously allows you to breathe in and to breathe out, which is why I said if you're consciously aware that somebody is, or that you are trying to count how many breaths per minute, it's not going to work, because as soon as you're consciously aware of something, you have complete control over something. And this conscious control can allow you to avoid inhaling any kind of noxious gas, or even when you're underwater to try to prevent inhaling water. We have chemoreceptors. Again, just like in the blood, we have chemosenders for breathing. They monitor oxygen and carbon dioxide. Those chemoreceptors in the blood are actually sending information to that respiratory center, because we need to make sure that we are getting enough carbon dioxide and getting enough oxygen, getting rid of enough carbon dioxide. There we go. So those aortic bodies and those carotid bodies, they're monitoring oxygen and carbon dioxide. This information goes to that medulla. Hypercapnia, these chemoreceptors get activated because there's too much hydrogen in the blood. Hyperventilation allows you to breathe in more oxygen, get rid of more carbon dioxide until your levels get back down to more of a normal level. Hypocapnia, that is decreased breathing. These different peripheral receptors, chemoreceptors, they're not stimulated. So information is not going to that dorsal respiratory group, but that arterial pressure of carbon dioxide is low. This can randomly cause people to hyperventilate voluntarily, but it can also cause people to hold their breath for unusually long periods of time, trying to increase that carbon dioxide level that is technically found in the blood. So these different areas, this shows, here's those carotid bodies, these little black or brown dots, and these are these different aortic bodies. These are those different chemoreceptors that are monitoring carbon dioxide and oxygen levels in the blood. And they're what allow changes in the depth of your breath, the rate of your breath, to try to maintain certain levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. This is a YouTube video that will go through and kind of explains your control of your respiration, all of the stuff that we've kind of gone through. This is a good video that'll go through on how we regulate our blood's pH. Again, our regulation of our blood pH is part of this homeostatic balance that we keep. And it's going to increase or decrease the amount of oxygen or carbon dioxide by altering your breathing rate, the depth of your breath, or to get back to that homeostatic balance of the amounts of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood. So, exercising. As soon as you start exercising, your breathing rate and depth is going to change. It's part of that limbic system, some of that, and that conscious control. We're trying to get more oxygen into the blood before we even start using up that oxygen, that extra oxygen, to prepare our body so we are ready to go. Proprioceptors, so those that are telling us where our body is in space, these are able to detect. That's why if you ever start running, at first you're usually breathing really heavy, and if you continue to run, your breathing usually evens out once your body kind of figures out what you're doing. This all kind of plays a role with trying to get enough oxygen in, enough carbon dioxide out, and kind of get that pH level evened out however we can, so your body is prepped and ready to go. So this chart here, we'll talk about different stimuli that's going to change your breathing, like voluntarily hyperventilating to change things out, increase in arterial blood pressure and carbon dioxide, prolonged pain. is actually going to change your breathing. Decreased blood pressure, even stretching of that anal sphincter is going to change your breathing rate. So hypoxia. There's low oxygen, pressure of oxygen in that blood, and it's usually because you're at a high altitude. But it could be airway obstruction or fluid in the lungs that's causing this. Anemic hypoxia. There's not enough functioning hemoglobin. And that in turn reduces the amount of oxygen that we can carry on our cells. A hemorrhage, you lose too much blood. Anemia, not enough red blood cells. There's even failure of that hemoglobin to carry its normal complement of oxygen. Carbon monoxide poisoning is another one. Ischemic hypoxia. There's not enough blood flow to the tissues, and it is so little that the pressure of oxygen and oxyhemoglobin levels are normal. We're just not getting enough blood flow to these tissues in the first place. Histotoxic hypoxia. So we deliver enough oxygen to the tissues, but the tissues cannot use it correctly. Cyanide poisoning. Cyanide poisoning prevents oxygen being used to make ATP. So that would cause histotoxic hypoxia. Baroreceptors or stretch reflexes. These are also going to play a role in our breathing and information coming down from the brain. We have these in the bronchi and the bronchioles. So when these receptors are actually stretched, which is why they're stretched receptors, this will happen during overinflation. So taking really deep breath in, that vagus nerve is going to send impulses to that dorsal respiratory group. It inhibits that dorsal respiratory group, and it causes our muscles to relax. It actually stops further inhalation. It causes you to start exhaling. As your lungs deflate, those stretch receptors are no longer stimulated. So that dorsal group is no longer inhibited. And we can get a new inhibition, which is an inflation reflex. In infants, this is normal, part of normal breathing. In an adult, it's not usually activated until that tidal volume is more than 1,500 milliliters of air coming in. And it's a protective mechanism. We do not want excessive inflation of our lungs. So your limbic system, I mentioned it before, they're going to play a role because it is an anticipatory mechanism that allows your body to know when certain events are going to happen. Emotional anxiety can change your breathing rate. It can send signals to that dorsal respiratory group that increases your rate and depth of breath. Temperature. So your body temperature goes up like a fever or exercise. That increases that rate of breathing. Decrease in breathing or decrease in temperature decreases your breathing rate. A sudden cold stimulus, like going from a nice warm house to -20 wind chills outside, that's a sudden cold stimulus. You get temporary apnea, or that not breathing at all. Pain. Of course, pain is going to change your breathing rate. It can bring on that absence of breathing, that apnea. It can eventually increase your breathing rate. Visceral pain can slow your breathing rate. So visceral pain would be anything in that chest or abdominal pelvic cavity. Again, stretching of that anal sphincter. It actually increases the breathing rate. And in a newborn, that's something that sometimes can stimulate a newborn to take their first breath. Or someone who stopped breathing. It's something else, something that can stimulate breathing. If there's irritation in your airways, could be physical, could be a chemical irritation, usually stops that breathing. And it'll cause you to cough or sneeze to try to get it out. Your blood pressure is going to play a role in your breathing rate because that carotid and aortic baroreceptors, not only are they detecting the different components of your blood, they detect your blood pressure. So if your blood pressure goes up, causes a decrease in that rate of breathing. A drop in that blood pressure increases that breathing rate. Kind of does the opposite. So when you are exercising, that respiratory system, that cardiovascular system, they make changes in response to whatever you're doing and for how long you're doing it, how long you're exercising for. So as your cardiac output goes up, the blood that goes to your lungs or pulmonary perfusion will also increase. The oxygen diffusing capacity, or that rate which oxygen can diffuse from that alveolar air into the blood, it can increase during maximal exercise. The greater the surface area available for oxygen diffusion. So when muscles contract during exercise, they use a lot of oxygen. They produce a lot of carbon dioxide. So it causes this increase in breathing rate. And that is caused by that dorsal respiratory group. Once you're done exercising, your breathing rate does decrease. It does slow down. It slows down gradually. If you remember back to the muscle chapter, it talked about how you need to replenish all of the oxygen stores, that oxygen debt recovery. So our breathing rate, it takes a little bit for it to slow back down again. It's a gradual decline back to its resting level once we've restored all of the oxygen that we had used up in our tissues. Cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking does a lot of things to our respiratory system. Nearly 500,000 deaths a year are from cigarette smoking, and there's over 4,000 different chemicals. 70 of them are carcinogenic. Carcinogenic means they cause cancer. Nicotine, it constricts those terminal bronchioles, so it decreases the amount of air that can get in and out of the lungs. There's carbon monoxide in that smoke. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin a lot more readily than oxygen does. So there's less oxygen again in our blood. Increase in mucus secretion by that bronchial tree because you're breathing in different irritants. It can inhibit, it almost paralyzes that cilia and eventually will destroy it. It can destruct those elastic fibers in the lungs. And this is what causes emphysema, is that destruction of those elastic fibers, and smoking leads to this. So our respiratory starts developing in about 4 weeks. It's different outgrowths that come from just below the pharynx, and it comes from the endoderm and the mesoderm. 26 weeks to birth, we get alveoli that develop. At about 30 weeks, mature alveoli start to develop. Breathing movements actually of a fetus will cause fluid into the lungs. So at birth, these lungs are about half filled with fluid when these babies first start breathing. That is why babies breathe so rapidly. This fluid gets absorbed by the lungs, get absorbed by the lymph, but it takes a little time. Some of it gets expelled through the nose and the mouth during delivery as that baby is squeezed out, but it takes a little while for this fluid to get completely cleaned out. And on the other end, when we get older, all right, we have decreased vital capacity. Our blood oxygen levels decrease. Alveolar macrophages are not as efficient. That cilia, that ciliary movement, that cilia moving that mucus away from the lungs to the back of the throat is not as efficient either. Elderly people are more susceptible to different respiratory issues or diseases. Our respiratory system, since it carries oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide, again, it's going to work with every single system in our body because every single one of our cells is making ATP. And our cells need this ATP to be able to function. So let's go through some different diseases. And let's start with the one everybody should be the most familiar with, the coronavirus or COVID-19. It's technically a family of viruses. This was just a new mutation found of this virus because the coronavirus is actually from viruses that can cause the common cold. There's even coronaviruses that cause a severe acute respiratory syndrome or SARS or Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS. People who have or had COVID-19, their symptoms can be very mild to where they don't even know they have it. They can cause upper respiratory infections, lower respiratory infections. It can cause people to get pneumonia. It can cause bronchitis. It's still a new emerging disease, so there's still a lot of research being conducted. What we do know is it takes 2 to 14 days for symptoms to actually appear after you have been exposed. From there, symptoms can be mild to severe. People who already have some sort of chronic condition, they are at higher risk of having more severe cases. It is transmitted through close contact. Lung cancer. Lung cancer is the leading cause of death in both men and women. About 1,600 deaths annually. That's a lot. And the problem is by the time it is diagnosed, it is already metastasized, which means it has traveled somewhere else in the body already. About 55% of people have seen that metastasis, and about 25%, it's also in those regional lymph nodes. So they'd be in the lymph nodes in that same area. Most people with lung cancer diagnosis tend to die within a year of diagnosis because it's people don't normally know they have lung cancer until it is too late. About 85% of these lung cancer cases are related to smoking. Can be secondhand smoke, so around somebody who smokes. Heart disease. Radiation, inhaled irritants like asbestos or radon gases. Emphysema is usually a precursor to lung cancer. Bronchogenic carcinoma is the most common type of lung cancer. So it's in those the epithelial cells of the bronchial tubes. People will have some sort of chronic cough. They could start spitting blood. Wheezing. Wheezing, if you put a stethoscope up to somebody's lungs to listen to them breathe, it's almost like a whistling sound that you will hear in someone who is wheezing. When they inhale or exhale, you hear this whistling type of sound in the lungs. These people tend to have shortness of breath. They can have chest pain, hoarseness, difficulty swallowing, weight loss, anorexia. If it starts traveling to the bones, they can have bone pain. Pneumonia. Pneumonia is an infection or inflammation in those pulmonary alveoli. There's a lot of cases per year, about 4 million. We get some sort of pathogen or microbe that makes its way into the lungs. And the problem is these microbes, they release toxins that damage your lungs. This damage causes this inflammation to happen. And that brings in an immune response. And your immune system, when they come in and start killing off cells, they have a damaging effect. Streptococcus pneumoniae is the most common microbe that is going to cause pneumonia. The people who are most susceptible are the elderly, which is why there is a vaccine out for pneumonia. Infants, anyone who is immunocompromised, could be on immune suppressing drugs because of an organ transplant. Their immune system, there are people out there where their immune system just never developed in the first place. Anyone who smokes, smoking brings in all kinds of different dangers. People with obstructive lung disease, these people are the most susceptible. And it usually starts from an upper respiratory infection. So something that's in the nose and the throat. And it just continues to travel down till it makes it into the lungs. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. This is where people have chronic and recurrent obstruction of the airway, which is going to increase that air resistance, so it makes it harder to breathe. This is the fourth leading cause of death. We have emphysema and chronic bronchitis are the two types of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So emphysema, destruction of the walls of those alveoli. So they used to have that nice little grape appearance that I was mentioning. What happens is the walls get destructed. So now those many different alveoli turn into one large one. That's what it tends to look like if you get down to look at the actual alveoli. So they have these abnormally large air spaces and they remain filled with air. There's not as large of a surface area to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. And eventually these people have what is known as like this barrel chest type of appearance. Long-term irritations can cause this emphysema. Cessation of stopping smoking. You need to remove those irritants. Exercise, breathing exercises, bronchodilators, and different inhalers. Even oxygen therapy can help people with emphysema. Chronic bronchitis is the other one type of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So this chronic bronchitis, they get these excessive secretions of this bronchomucus. And because all this mucus, they have a productive cough. It is considered chronic if they have it for at least 3 months of the year for 2 successive years. Again, cigarette smoking is the leading cause. Excessive mucus glands and goblet glands are making a lot of mucus. And it leads to narrowing airways, and there's so much mucus that cilia eventually doesn't work as well. These people have shortness of breath, wheezing, cyanosis, so they're not getting enough oxygen, so their skin starts to turn blue. Cyan is blue. Pulmonary hypertension, another form of higher blood pressure, but it's breathing related. Similar treatments to emphysema. Asthma. Asthma is chronic airway inflammation. Could be airway hypersensitivity to all kinds of different stimuli, or airway obstruction. Sometimes it can be partially reversible. Kids who are diagnosed with asthma, they can grow out of it. So they can be partially reversible because they kind of goes away as they get older. May require treatment, it may not. As I said, it's more common in children than adults. It could be because of smooth muscle spasms in those bronchi that kind of reduce or close off that airway. Could be edema, so fluid, that mucus in those airways, too much mucus secretion, damage to that epithelium. They typically will react to something that a normal person without asthma doesn't react to. Pollen, dust mites, molds, foods, even emotionally upset, like stress, can trigger asthma. Aspirin, sulfating agents, exercise. Some people have exercise-induced asthma. So they breathe just fine, but as soon as they start exercising, it triggers breathing problems. Cold air. People who have asthma have a really hard time in cold air. Again, cigarette smoking. These people may have that difficulty breathing, coughing, wheezing. They may feel chest tightness. They may feel like something's putting pressure down on their chest at all times, which leads to tachycardia, that increased heart rate. Because you're always having problems breathing, trying to get enough oxygen in, you're not getting enough oxygen, you're tired. Could have moist skin. It can give people anxiety because they're really struggling to breathe, which can trigger anxiety, which triggers harder breathing. It's kind of a catch-22 with those. So in an acute attack, something triggered it. Dust, pollen, mold, certain foods. Albuterol, which is a beta androgenic agonist. And what it's doing is it causes bronchodilation by relaxing the smooth muscles in the airways. most people with asthma, this albuterol is what's kind of known as an emergency inhaler. You use it during an asthma attack, but they usually have some sort of, especially people who've had asthma and they know kind of, and it's kind of a daily trigger, they have a daily inhaler that works to prevent attacks. But they still usually carry an albuterol inhaler around just in case. Tuberculosis or TB. This is bacterial by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And it affects the lungs and that pleura. It's when that bacteria gets inside the lungs, they can multiply and cause inflammation. And it causes those neutrophils and macrophages to come in. They try to eat up that bacteria. But if the immune system is not impaired, that bacteria can remain dormant. But as soon as you have an impaired immunity, that allows that bacteria to get into the bloodstream, get into the lymph, and it can go to lots of different organs. These people are usually tired, weight loss, lethargy, so they're very tired, anorexic, so they're have a hard time eating, fevers, night sweats, cough, dyspnea. They can have chest pain. Here's the interesting thing is over the past several years, TB has risen, the amount of cases of TB, and it's related to the spread of HIV. Someone with HIV is more likely to develop tuberculosis because their immune system is already impaired. Homelessness, drug abuse, immigration. There's countries that have very high prevalence of tuberculosis, and then they come to this country not knowing that they may have it. Crowding and housing. There's medication that is used to treat tuberculosis. Pulmonary edema. This is where fluid accumulates in the interstitial spaces in those pulmonary alveoli. It could be because of increased permeability of those pulmonary capillaries. So fluids are traveling out more readily. Increased pressure in those pulmonary capillaries, that's because of heart failure. That can cause more fluids to get into the lungs. People have difficulty breathing. They have that wheezing, that whistling sound. Tachypnea, increased breaths per minute, restlessness, feeling of suffocation. They turn blue, pale. They can have that pulmonary hypertension. They usually give oxygen and drugs to try to dilate those bronchioles. They try to lower the blood pressure. Diuretics to get rid of those fluids. Pulmonary edema can also be caused by diet pills. Something else to kind of keep in mind. SIDS. We have this and one more. Sudden infant death syndrome. It is an unexpected death of what appears to be a very healthy infant during their sleep. It's usually, it doesn't usually occur within the first 2 weeks or after 6 months. It's between that time. It's usually between the 2nd and 4th month is when this occurs. And it's more common in those premature infants, so they are born before their birth date or due date, males, low birth weights, babies of drug users or smokers, any baby that had to be resuscitated, this is common in. Upper respiratory tract infections, and if they've had a sibling that has died of SIDS, they have a higher rate of it. African Americans and Native American babies seem to be at more risk. And we don't really know what causes it. But there are some theories. Maybe an abnormality in the mechanism that controls that breathing. So in the brain, in that dorsal respiratory group in that brain. Low levels of oxygen in the blood may be to blame. Severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. This is another emerging infectious disease. It is new, and just like COVID, it is changing. West Nile encephalitis, mad cow disease, and AIDS are other examples of severe acute respiratory syndrome. It first appeared in China in 2002. I remember this. It spread worldwide. These people have fever, malaise, muscle aches. They have a non-productive cough. They have a hard time breathing. They have chills. Well, if you have a fever, a lot of times it gives you chills. Headaches, they could have diarrhea. It is spread through person-to-person contact, and there is no effective treatment. Death rate is 5 to 10%. And is more common among the elderly and people who have some sort of other medical conditions. Thank you for listening to part 2 of the respiratory system. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.